Where the taiga stops and the tundra begins lies the very unique little town of Churchill, Manitoba. This town's only home to about 1,300 people year-round, but it's also home to over 1,000 polar bears depending on the time of year. And the citizens of Churchill have developed a very unique way of dealing with this crisis. What if I told you they built an entire polar bear prison, and that is actually a good thing for animal conservation? Well, this video is going to get pretty crazy pretty fast, so let's hold on to our Santa hats as I cue in the intro.
You can run into someone's house and we don't lock our vehicles. I mean, they're everywhere around here.
Grandma got run over by a reindeer.
Does this guy end up in bear jail? He didn't do anything wrong.
You can say there's no such thing as Santa, but as for me and Grandpa, we believe.
So before we get into all the intrinsic juicy details about how polar bear jail works, we need to talk about the town of Churchill, Manitoba itself. If you didn't know by now, Churchill is located along the Hudson Bay, and acts as the perfect example of what a subpolar climate would be like, having snow for about 8 months out of the year, and containing a wide variety of different animal species from gray wolves to caribou, black bears, and of course the animal we will be talking about most today, the polar bear. These polar bears are particularly common in Churchill as the town lies right along their migration path, where they travel down south to wait for the Hudson Bay to freeze over, and once the Hudson Bay does freeze over, they will disperse out onto the sea ice, leaving the mainland alone. But as the many polar bears that inhabit the Hudson Bay wait for the sea ice to freeze over, they spend most of their time on the mainland. And with the town of Churchill bordering along the Hudson Bay, the polar bears often tend to go straight into town. When the sea ice does freeze over, seals make up the vast majority of the polar bear's diet. But once the sea ice disappears, the seals become much harder to hunt, and this leaves pretty much anything and everything else that is meat on the menu for these giant polar bears, including humans. So naturally, the people of Churchill had to find a way to defend themselves to ensure they don't become these giant bears' next meal. Initially, Churchill's polar bear policy was to euthanize any polar bear that walks into town, usually by bullet. But because of the polar bear's cultural significance both to the local townsfolk and to the tourists that come and visit, it was concluded that they need to find another way of dispatching of all these polar bears. And this is where the crazy but also fairly intelligent idea of the polar bear police force comes in. Yes, I am not kidding, there are literally dozens of people who could consider themselves to be the polar bear police. And honestly, I think that's kind of awesome. Okay, getting back on track, the main purpose of a polar bear police officer is to scare the polar bears out of town using non-lethal force. This is actually fairly efficient as polar bears are known for being a lot more skittish than their smaller but overall more hostile brown bear relatives. The main methods the polar bear police force would use would involve flares and rubber bullets, all being used simply to scare the bears out of town and keep them away from the lovely citizens who are just trying to spend their day not getting eaten. Still, just like all other animals, polar bears have their own unique personalities, and some of them are a lot braver than others and simply don't get scared away by the polar bear police force's non-lethal methods. And eventually these polar bears become repeated offenders, oftentimes raiding trash cans similar to what we see with black bears in the southeastern United States. And normally in the southeastern United States, when this occurs, the black bears are sadly euthanized. But Churchill Canada has a very different method of dealing with their own respective bear problems. And this is where the wonderful idea of a polar bear jail was born. Created in 1982, originally meant to house up to 20 bears in 20 different cells, the polar bear jail is meant to be the final punishment to these polar bears who continuously go into town being unfazed by the polar bear police force. Just like a real jail, this is meant to reinforce the idea that if a polar bear commits the crime of going into town, they will be punished. And while this idea might seem incredibly silly on paper, it actually works really well in practice, as normally when a bear enters polar bear prison, they learn not to become repeated offenders, as they simply learn to avoid the town of Churchill over time, as they do not want to be locked up in a cell for 20 to 30 days on end. As let's face it, just like humans, these adorable man-eaters don't like being locked up either. And while I certainly don't consider these polar bear jail cells to be animal abuse by any means, as they are specifically built in order to teach the bears a lesson and avoid euthanization of these bears at all costs, these cells are very similar to a human jail cell, holding very little enrichment and basically serving the purpose of being a cramped, confined space meant to bore the polar bears out of ever going back to Churchill. As these polar bears are fairly smart animals, and over time will learn to associate the town of Churchill with the polar bear police and the prison. These bears are so smart that originally some of them would purposely get arrested in order to get fed in the prison. But over time, the polar bear police force would realize this and stop feeding the bears in their respective cells as another way of discouraging them from ever going back to town. And while it might seem a little cruel, this method has actually helped to decrease the amount of repeated offenders over the years. And as of 2024, the polar bear prison contains 28 polar bear cells, with at least 4 of them being dedicated to housing mother polar bears with their cubs, as oftentimes mother polar bears will also run into town with the purpose of feeding their cubs. Ideally just garbage, though there's many other options on the menu, that's for sure. And because of that reason, specialized cells have been built in order to house mother polar bears with their respective cubs, with the cubs being released with their respective mom once their sentence is up. When each polar bear is eventually released from its cell, they're often given a specific mark on their back in order to act as a sort of ID and also deterrent, so they are less likely to come back to town, as the mark ruins their camouflage temporarily. And each polar bear is kept track of by using an ear tag, so they could tell for sure if it's a repeated offender or not. This also helps with conservation, as they get a much better idea of how many polar bears are around the Hudson Bay by tagging them through these polar bear jail programs. And while the polar bears are being tranquilized both going to and from the polar bear jail, a variety of different scientists will often come in, taking a variety of notes about the polar bear's health and diet, among other things. As let's face it, a polar bear being tranquilized through a polar bear police program is definitely one of the safest options in order to research wild polar bears. Man, that is such a weird sentence to say out loud. This is because, if you haven't figured it out by now, the polar bear could get up to 1 ton and is literally the apex predator of the Arctic, and in most places they are actually pretty rare, with Churchill being one of the main exceptions, particularly in the fall, when the polar bears are at their most abundant, waiting for the sea ice to freeze over again. And while polar bears are arrested throughout the year, the vast majority of arrests take place in the fall, when the polar bears are at their most abundant and also at their most hungry. During this time frame, everything from polar bear fights to polar bears trying to eat beluga whales can all be observed in the town of Churchill, Manitoba. And because of this, Churchill also over time became a hotspot for tourists wanting to see the polar bears and other Arctic animals. And of course, you can't forget about the northern lights as well, as Churchill is also known for that. Overall, this incredibly beautiful and majestic town is really only accessible by plane and rail, and because of its very unique geographic isolation, the town has a very unique sense of culture and relevancy, with tourists from around the world, including hopefully one day myself, all wanting to go to this town to see the many wonderful Arctic animals that inhabit it, on top of the northern lights. And during the fall, while polar bears are busy making Halloween illegal and raiding people's houses, the tourists are coming into town supplying many of the townsfolk the money they need in order to survive. And in an ironic twist of fate, this is all possible because of the polar bear prison that was built in 1982 in order to teach these polar bears to stay out of town. And because this method has been working, the polar bears and people of Churchill, Manitoba are able to coexist mostly peacefully. And while conflicts still occur, thanks to the polar bear police force, they are now able to be resolved through non-lethal force, which is sadly not the case in many other parts of the world where human-wildlife conflicts are the normal. And while the polar bear jail/prison, whatever you want to call it, might seem like animal abuse at first, it's actually one of the most humane methods of being able to keep the polar bears around for both the tourists and citizens of Churchill to admire, ideally from a distance, of course. Still, sadly, due to the increasing temperatures worldwide, the sea ice has been freezing over later and later throughout the year, leading to the polar bears being hungrier and hungrier for longer periods of time. This directly leads to even more human-wildlife conflict as more polar bears go into town wanting to see if they could find more food. And it also means that the polar bears will be hanging around town longer waiting for the sea ice to freeze over. For this reason, despite polar bear numbers decreasing worldwide, the amount of attacks caused by polar bears in Churchill has only been going up, contributing to even more and more polar bear arrests and the polar bear jail, in some cases even being fully filled. And for as adorable as these Coca-Cola mascots are, they are still incredibly dangerous and are actually the largest apex land predator on Earth. And because of that, polar bear attacks must be taken incredibly seriously, and without the polar bear police force, these polar bear attacks would be even more common and likely even more often fatal. Thankfully though, despite these polar bears going rogue more and more often, the town of Churchill has still been trying to find more and more ways in order to coexist with these amazing apex predators. And what matters is that hopefully in the future more towns could learn from Churchill and find their own unique ways of dealing with their respective wildlife. Is the polar bear jail system perfect? No. And do the polar bears still face much greater threats, such as climate change and hybridization with grizzly bears? Of course, but at least the town of Churchill is making a really good effort in order to preserve these amazing apex predators for generations to come. And hopefully in the future I'll be able to see these polar bears in the wild where they belong, in large part thanks to the polar bear police force. Now for as weird of a sentence as it is, I'm gonna get going and I hope you all have an incredibly nice final week of the year. Merry Christmas and goodbye.